Professor Fedlayson was born in Boston and grew up in Sharon, Massachusetts. He received his master's and PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. He joined the faculty at Ben Gurion University in Israel in 1975. At Ben Gurion, he chaired the Department of Politics and Government and directed the Hubert H. Humphrey Center of Social Ecology and the Overseas Study Program. He retired from Ben Gurion in 2010. Since then, Professor Layson has taught many students from France to Australia, and even at my own alma mater, American University. He has authored over 80 scholarly articles and chapters in books and written and edited 12 books. His pioneering research on the response of American Jewish organizations to German Jewish refugees in the 1930s opened a new field in Holocaust studies. He received the Israel Political Science Association's Award for the Outstanding English Language Book in 2005 for the struggle for Soviet Jewry in American politics, Israel versus the American Jewish establishment. Fred's current research focuses on European Jewish refugees in Shanghai from 1937 to 1951. The focus of the research is on the aid provided by the American Joint Distribution Committee. And now I will turn it over to Professor Layson to tell us more about this exciting research about Shanghai. Like I said before, we'll begin the presentation and then open up for some Q&A. As the presentation is going on, feel free to type questions in the chat, which I'll get to at the end, or simply wait and share them out loud at the end of the presentation. Thank you again for being here for this very special presentation. I am going to turn it over to Professor Layson. Oh, Professor, there we go.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Rabbi. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone tonight. And I trust and I hope that my talk will be worthwhile and interesting. Let me just start with a story leading up to what happened in Shanghai between 1938, approximately November 38 until the end of World War II. And I went to, several people have been to China. We've probably seen the same things in Shanghai. But I went to Shanghai for the first time in 1999. I was invited to China under an exchange program between Ben Gurion University, and we had ties with about 7 or 8 Chinese universities. So I actually had the opportunity to go all over China visiting various universities. The most interesting place was Shanghai, and I was at Fudan University. And one morning, someone from PR, a woman, who happened to know a math professor at Ben Gurion University, she called me up and she said, I want to take you someplace. So we got in the car and it was raining. And in Shanghai, even then in '99, there were a lot of, there's a flooding whenever it rained. And she took me to a synagogue. And the synagogue, it was sort of a synagogue. Some people prayed there now and then, but it had been an Ashkenazi shul before. And they were starting to collect things from the refugees. And she brought in some man who had been a caretaker in the synagogue during World War II. And he talked to me all about the Jewish refugees. The point that I want to make is, and this is very important to understand what I'm going to be talking about, I became aware of one thing, and it was very strange as someone Jewish, because she kept on talking and the man kept on talking about World War II, and they mentioned the Holocaust, and there was a ghetto in Shanghai. And as a Jew, when you relate to the Holocaust, all of a sudden, one thing became very obvious to me. And what was that? What was obvious to me was that as bad as the Jews had it in Shanghai, and we'll be talking about that, the Chinese had it much worse. In other words, I looked at my hosts, or my 2 hosts, this lady from the university and this caretaker, and they were telling me about how difficult it was for the Jews during World War II. I understood that as bad as it was for them, the average Chinese person suffered much, much more. Hundreds of thousands, you could probably go into the millions of Chinese were killed. The number of Jews killed by the Japanese, you can probably count on one hand or maybe 2 hands, fingers. That's it. It's a very, very different experience. Okay, now we're going to go into my presentation. Rabbi, can you put up the PowerPoint? Okay, good. Oh, terrific. Okay, well, the topic is how 20,000 European Jews found a safe haven in Shanghai, China during the Holocaust. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now I use the word Holocaust because it is a chapter of the Holocaust, and it relates to what took place in Germany. Without Hitler, no one would have showed up in Shanghai. Now, one thing one should keep in mind in terms of dates, most Jews could leave Germany until June of 1941. That's when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. But until that time, almost any Jew in Germany, not everyone, but 99%, if they had a ticket or if they had a visa to go someplace, they could leave the country. The policy of Hitler and his government was to get the Jews out of Germany at this particular point in time, up until June 1941, it was not to slaughter them. Now, one of the things that you find in Shanghai amongst people that made it there are hundreds of men among them who were in concentration camps, and their wives managed to get them tickets on ships going to Shanghai. They'd go to the Gestapo, show the ticket, and the husband would be released from a concentration camp on the condition that within 10 days, he's out of the country. So keep this in mind, the June 1941 date. At the same time, one has to keep in mind what the Holocaust was all about. Hitler wanted the Jews to leave. No one in the world wanted to take Jews, including the United States of America. We had a very discriminatory quota system, and the quota wasn't filled until 38 because consuls in Germany didn't want to give visas to German Jews to come to America. They wanted to preserve white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America and exclude Jews. So in July of 38, Roosevelt had the Evian Conference in France. People came from all over the world, including Golda Meir from Palestine. No one wanted to take Jewish refugees. The only place where they could go, and this is sort of ironic, was Shanghai, China. It was an exception because you could get into, if you showed up in Shanghai, you didn't need a passport when you got off the boat. You didn't need a visa, nothing. And I'll explain why that was the case. Probably the only place in the world. Next slide. Now, one should keep in mind in Shanghai, there were two Jewish communities before the refugees arrived. There were the Baghdadi, you can call them Sfaradim, Jews originally from Spain, but they were basically people whose roots go back to Baghdad in Iraq. Beginning in the 1840s, some of them migrated down into India, and then as part of the British Empire, they ended up in Shanghai. Now, amongst them were three very well-known families, clans, the Sassoons, the Kaduris, and the Haduns. Now they were very active in trade, in manufacturing. I have opium, tea, and silk. They were very, very big in the opium trade as well. Now, the centerpiece of Shanghai, and if you saw Spielberg's movie, Empire of the Sun, is something called the Bund, B-U-N-D. It's the waterfront with all these Art Deco buildings. If there's anything worthwhile to seeing in China, at least in Shanghai, it's to see the Bund. Much of the Bund was built by these people. The main street, the main commercial street in Shanghai, East Nanjing Road, which runs all the way to the Bund, to the waterfront, was built almost entirely by someone named Hadun, who is an exception to the Iraqi community. He married a Chinese woman. Most of the Iraqis stayed amongst themselves. Amongst them, these three families were some of the wealthiest people in all of China, but many of the Iraqi Jews were just middle class or poor, and they all worked in the firms and the industries of these other people. At most, there were about 700 of them in the 1930s. The second Jewish community were the Russians, the Ashkenazi. They started coming to China after the Soviet Revolution. Some escaped the revolution, some were soldiers that served in Manchuria. They decided to stay. They didn't want to go back to the Ukraine and other places. A lot of them had settled in Harbin, which is up in Manchuria. After 31, when the Japanese showed up, they started coming down into Shanghai. They were successful small business people, professionals, doctors, lawyers, etc. There were about 4,000 of them, 4,000 to 6,000 by World War II. Okay, so they live in Shanghai. Here you see, these are the Kadoris on the left, Lawrence and Horace. And this is Sir Victor Sassoon, who built the famous Peace Hotel, which is on the Bund, one of the wealthiest people in the world or in Asia. Let's go on. Now, Shanghai in the 1930s, this is important to try to, it's not really so complicated. The city was divided into 4 separate entities, and they more or less were independent of each other. Now, this goes back to the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, after the Opium Wars. The Europeans won, the Chinese lost. What did the Chinese have to do? They had to open up 5 port cities, including Shanghai, to Europeans. And they gave the Europeans this word, extraterritorial rights, which meant the following. In Shanghai, British citizens, if they broke the law, they killed someone, they stole something, they robbed a bank, they don't go to Chinese courts, they go to British courts. Germans go to German courts, French go to French courts. In other words, they're colonial, they're powers, they're independent of the local government and the national government authorities. So the city had the 4 following areas. The largest part of the city was called the Chinese City. It was run by the nationalist government out of Nanjing. However, after 1937, the Japanese drove the Chinese army out of the city. So the Japanese really controlled most of the city from 1937. There was something called the International Settlement. This is where the British, American, and Japanese were, along with the Germans until the end of World War I. And that was run by the Shanghai Municipal Council. It had an area called Hongkou, which later became totally controlled by the Japanese. The 4th area was the French concession. The French had their own little district. It was controlled by the French consul. Now, to give you an idea of numbers, there are about 4 million Chinese in the city. 1.5 million are refugees because of the fighting with the Japanese from 1937. In 1936, there were about 20,000 Japanese, and that community continues to grow. 15,000 Russians, 9,000 British, 5,000 Germans and Austrians, not including the Jewish refugees. Okay, so these 4 different communities live sort of side by side. The Chinese are every place. They're in the international settlement. They're also in the French concession. They live every place. Okay, next. Now, how did the Jews end up coming there? The Japanese, they went into Manchuria, the northern part of China, in the late 1920s. They liked Jews. They were sort of philo-Semitic. There were 2 people in the military, Noshiru and Inazuka, excuse my pronunciation. They were experts on the Jews. They had this idea, and they were very influential in the military, that when Japan took over Manchuria, it wanted to take over all of China, it wanted to develop the area. They had this idea that we can get Jewish investments. They saw the Jews as being wealthy. So they almost had these anti-Semitic stereotypes of the Jews being powerful bankers, etc. They remember Jacob Schiff, 1904 and 1905, the Russian-Japanese War. He was on Wall Street. He financed the Japanese in their war against Russia. So they thought the Jews have money, let's bring in Jewish refugees. Jews will invest and will develop Manchuria and other places. They also thought if they could be good to the Jews in America who are powerful bankers and influential, they'll influence Roosevelt not to be anti-Japanese. Next slide. Now, when Hitler comes to power, what happened? The Chiang Kai-shek's government was liberal. It didn't mind if Jews wanted to come to China. And one of their consuls in Vienna started giving out visas. His name was He Feng Shan, gave visas to Viennese Jews. People knew very little about China, about Shanghai, any place, but a couple of hundred Jews left Europe and came to various places in China. A lot of doctors came, and a lot of them went inland to various hospitals and other places. Now, but what happened? In Kristallnacht of November 10th, 9th and 10th, 1938, that's the pogrom in which all the synagogues are burnt down, Jewish stores are vandalized, 20,000 Jewish men are put in prison. What happens? German Jews start leaving en masse. And one place they could go was Shanghai. Now, when the Japanese drove out the Chinese army, everyone working in immigration control, visa control, all the people fled with the Chinese army. No one supervised visas. There was no authority over entry into the city. The Japanese didn't care. The British were only interested in what happens in their zone, the French in their zone. So these Jews started showing up. They landed in the Japanese part. The Japanese let them in. Everyone could come in. No one stopped them. So about 18,000 Jews end up coming from November 38 through 1941. Now, what happened? How would they come? Most of them came by boat. Italian liners, German liners, Japanese liners. They ripped people off. People paid a fortune to get on these boats. But again, you have a ticket. You can get out of a concentration camp. It's a place of freedom. God only knows what's in Shanghai, but it's much better than staying in Germany. However, what happened? This lasted until June 10th, 1940, when Italy entered the war. Once Italy entered the war, the British closed down the Mediterranean Sea, which meant no one could get out. And you couldn't get there by ship. So how did they go? They went by land across the Soviet Union. They took the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now that meant you had to go into the Soviet Union, which was controlled by the communists, and you paid a fee. This was all arranged by various Jewish groups, and the JDC played a role. And people got tickets where they could go from Kovno, from Lithuania. You got on a train, you went to Moscow, and then you went to Siberia. When you got to the end of Siberia, either you went down into Manchuria, or you went to Vladivostok, excuse my pronunciation, on the Pacific, and a boat took you down to Japan. That's the way it worked. Now, what we have to keep in mind was that the Shanghai economy collapsed in about 37, which meant that the economy probably wouldn't absorb or provide the means by which people could make a living. It wasn't a great place to go economically. In the early 30s, Shanghai was booming. In the late 30s, it wasn't booming. The Japanese were fighting. The city of Shanghai was cut off from the rest of China. The whole economy fell apart. Next slide. Now here you see, this is the Chinese consul in Vienna who gave out visas, and this is someone called Sugihara, the Japanese consul in Kovno, who there have been movies about. Next slide, I'll tell you about him right now. Now, one other group that showed up in Shanghai, there were about 1,000 Polish Jews, not German, Polish Jews. And they basically were in Lithuania. And Lithuania had become independent for a little bit of time and they were caught between the Russians coming in, the Soviet Union coming in, and the Germans. They both wanted, eventually there'd be a war there in 41. So Sugihara, who was sent as a spy by the Japanese, was the consul. He started giving out transit visas. In other words, some yeshiva students and some Jews in Poland had visas to go to parts of South America controlled by the Dutch, some of the islands. How do you get there? Well, you go by way of Japan. So he gave them visas to go to Japan, transit visas. And then when they get to Japan, they then go to the Caribbean. Most of them never made it to the Caribbean, but they did make it to Japan. So one yeshiva called the Mir Yeshiva, 440 rabbis and all the rabbinical students, the whole group got visas, and the whole group ended up in Kobe, Japan in 1939, 1940. And then later, the Japanese shipped them all over to Shanghai in 1941. Now, what's interesting about this group in Shanghai, and we don't have time to go into it at all, I have a sarcastic comment. All Jews are equal. Some Jews are more equal than others. What happened was the ultra-Orthodox in America, Agudas Israel, Agudat Yisrael, set up an organization called Vada Hatzalah, the Body of Saviors. It was a committee to save Orthodox Jews in Europe, to save the yeshiva students. So basically, they were sending in aid all the time along with the Joint Distribution Committee. So your average yeshiva student or rabbi got about, I don't know, financially, they got about 10 times more than the average Jewish refugee. That was an issue throughout the period. Okay, let's move on. Now here you see in one of the local synagogues, the Beit Aharon, which is a Sephardi synagogue, not used that much, they set up the yeshiva. They had a yeshiva all during World War II. They studied day and night, etc. Okay, let's move on. They were there, but they were separate. Now, the Jews of Shanghai responded, especially the Sephardim. They set up something called the International Committee for Granting Relief to European Refugees. It was called the Koma Committee. He was a converted Hungarian Jew. Sir Victor Sassoon put up all the money. They tended to try to give people money to start businesses. So hundreds of families became independent amongst the refugees because of aid from this committee. The General Aid Committee was called the Committee for the Assistance of Eastern European Jewry, headed by Michael Spielman, who was a Dutch Jewish businessman, banker, and they basically provided people with housing, with food, with clothing, with medical care. Overseas, money started coming in from something called the Council for German Jewry in London until the war broke out, then they stopped. But the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee in New York, without their aid, tens of thousands of people, they all would have died. They would have starved to death. But the JDC basically saves everyone. Now, there was some criticism that the local Jewish community never did enough. The Russian Jews tended to stay away from the German Jews. If anyone knows Israel very well, there were a lot of problems in Israel in the 30s when all the Yekis came. When the German Jews showed up, all these Polish Jews that had built the country, they weren't excited about it. They were excited that we're getting Jews coming, but they didn't really like the German Jews. There was a lot of friction, cultural friction, etc. So that was a problem here. And then some of the wealthy people just didn't give enough money to take care of other Jews. Next. Now, what happened was the main groups comes in after November 38. Those people with some resources, not everyone was poor that came in. If you had money, you went to the French concession, about 4,000 refugees. Others went to the international settlement, or else to the poorest part of the international settlement, Hong Kong. They settled there, they had apartments, they lived. Some of them lived very, very poorly. The worst place you'd be in these lane housing with no toilets, no showers. You imagine people wealthy, not wealthy, but they might have lost everything when they left. They lived in Berlin, they lived in Vienna, all the culture, and now you're living in a dark, airless apartment where you don't have a toilet and you have a bucket. And the bucket is there, and every day someone comes in to empty the bucket. That's what life was like, very dreary place, etc. It's hot in the summer and you freeze in the winter. The most expensive item is getting coal, which people don't usually have the resources for. But they were the better off people. The have-not, but some people had nice apartments. They lived well. They had money, but they were the minority. The have-nots went to what were called the Heima, the dorms. These were set up by the Relief Committee, the Jewish Relief Committee. Basically, people either lived in a dormitory where women were separated from men by floor, or else in some places they had family units. In these dorms, there were usually some toilets and there were some showers. Other people got rent subsidies. About 2,500 lived in the homes. and welfare. By 1945, 11,000 people were on welfare by this Jewish committee. Meals were also provided to thousands of people. All food was kosher, which was very expensive. But again, the most important item, the most expensive item in feeding people was the coal for cooking. It's sort of strange. Okay, next. Here you see some pictures, people registering. This is a dormitory room in the middle, and here you see a soup kitchen. Just, okay, move on. Now, closing the door of Shanghai. By December of 1938, you got about 1,500 coming in all the time. And people were having trouble. Most people, the veterans in the city said, how can we absorb these people? There aren't jobs, they're going to take away jobs from other people, etc. So there was some competition over jobs, rents started going up, political balance was even a problem in the local council. There was a lot of tension between the Russian and the German Jews. So there began to be calls from the local residents, meaning the British, the French, the Dutch, not the Chinese. Chinese weren't factors. They were out of it. They didn't count. There were 1.5 million Chinese refugees. They weren't involved in the local politics. And amongst the Japanese too, they started saying, we want to stop this influx. We can't take in more people. Now that also included the local Jewish community. So you had, and this is interesting, the JDC and the London Council, which were providing the aid, they appealed to German Jewish organizations, don't let people come to Shanghai. We don't want them to come. We can't afford it. We can't take in anymore. We can't provide them with what they need. The Shanghai Municipal Council wired Jewish organizations in New York, Paris, and London. Speak to the German Jews. Tell them not to come. The Secretary of State of the United States, Cordell Hull, had his ambassador go to the German foreign minister and plead with him, don't let people go to Shanghai. Now, one of the ironic things is the German government policy is go, leave, go to Shanghai. Now, I know this is hard to believe, but it's documented. The Gestapo chartered a boat. There weren't enough places on the boats. They chartered a boat for Jewish refugees. One boat. They wouldn't charter any more boats because they didn't want to spend money to save Jewish lives. But this is the irony of the thing. Okay, let's move on. We're almost finishing up. Now, the Japanese then acted, since they were really in charge, even though they didn't take over till after Pearl Harbor. And after they met with Sir Victor Sassoon, who said to them, you know, we have enough Jews already. We don't need any more refugees. So the Japanese consul wrote back to Japan, back to Tokyo, and said, if we close the gates, the Jews there's not going to be demonstrations against us. So the Japanese decided, let's close the gates. So in August of 1939, the Shanghai Municipal Government, that's the SMC, they denied entry to Jewish refugees into Shanghai. They closed the city down. However, in October, late October, they issued guidelines because people said, well, look, you're closing the gates, but I have my wife and my son. They're still in Berlin. What am I supposed to do? So they allowed anyone that showed up, anyone that came, provided they had $400 per couple or $100 per child, they could come in. In addition, anyone that had a work contract or intent to marry a local person could also come into the country. Okay, now, but basically, by March of 1940, the Mediterranean is closed. June of 1941, you can't get out of Europe. That's the war. Okay, now, JDC sent over Laura Margolis, who shows up in May of 41, a woman. Now, what her job was primarily was to help the American consulate get German Jews that had visas into the United States, to get them out of Shanghai, get them to the States. But she also became very critical of all the aid that was being given by this local Jewish organization the JDC was funding. She thought it was a disaster. Now, next, I just want to show you her picture. Go ahead. Here she is. Now, what's amazing about this is she's a woman. I'm looking at women here in the audience. The real world, in the Jewish world, women did all the work. Well, I'm sorry, women did all the work at home. It's the men, all these Jewish organizations, they're all male, no women. Here's a Jewish social worker from Cleveland, goes to Havana, and then comes to Shanghai. She was a real pioneer. And they were all afraid, how can we let a woman go, etc. But she knew what she was doing. Next. Now, what she did was, after Pearl Harbor, all the Baghdadis, the wealthy Jews, they were all arrested by they're interned by the Japanese. Why? Because they're enemy nationals. They're British citizens. So they're all in internment camps. So the Russian Jews become more dominant. The Russian Jews weren't touched by the Japanese because of a treaty between Germany, between Japan and Russia. So the Russian Jews set up a kitchen fund, which is going to run the welfare system for the Jewish refugees. Okay, so they feed about 4,000. They used to feed 8,000. They had to save money. They're running out of money. Then they opened up a new kitchen, etc. So they provide basically housing, food, and medical care. Next slide. Now, one of the amazing things she does, and then we'll end this in a second, about the JDC is sending in $30,000 a month to keep all these people alive. All of it, once Pearl Harbor takes place, you can't send money to Shanghai. It's controlled by the Japanese. They're fighting a war with the United States. So what does she do? She gets loans. She gets an agreement from JDC. The Japanese cooperated with her, and she gets local Jews, Russians, to give money, to loan money to JDC, to this local welfare organization. She gets one loan for $180,000 and later on for $210,000. She basically kept them in business during World War II until 44. In 44, money can come in again. She gets interned along with her assistant, Manny Siegel. Manny Siegel stays interned. Laura is sent back to the United States, exchanged for Japanese people. Let's go on. Now, they create a designated area, a ghetto. But I say it's not a World War II ghetto. In February of 43, the Japanese said all stateless refugees that arrived after 37 have to move to a designated area in Hongqiu. They put barbed wire around it. If you wanted to go out, you had to have a pass, and you had to come back at a certain time. Several thousand Jews that lived in other parts of the city had to give up their apartments, give up their businesses, and they all had to move into this designated area. It was very hard living, very primitive. A lot of people had very difficult conditions, and they lived fairly well in other parts of the city of Shanghai. So that's what took place. But I emphasize, it's not a World War II ghetto. No one is being shot, no one is being killed, etc. There's no slave labor, etc. No one's being deported. Next slide. Now, here you see some pictures. This is typical housing. This housing, there could be 5, 6 families living in a 2-3 room apartment. So something that's been in the kitchen becomes a bedroom for one family. Very, very crowded. Here you see some neighborhood children. Most people living in the area were Chinese in the ghetto. You had Chinese, you even had white Russian Christians along with the Jews. And here you see some of the activities they had. They even had a Boy Scout troop. So, you know, it's a mixed bag of what was taking place. Next. Now, German influence, we don't have time to go into this. Some people think, someone wrote a book about this, a rabbi. A member of the Gestapo shows up, Joseph Meisinger. He did a lot of horrible things in Warsaw. And there's this idea that the Japanese had a plan, they called it the Fugu Plan, to kill the Jews of Shanghai. They were going to take them out in boats out to sea. Shanghai is on the ocean. Take them out to sea, it's on a river, and then they were going to sink the boats. But no one has ever, even though a lot of people believe that and people wrote letters about it and talked about it, no one has ever found documentation to prove it. To a great extent, I mean, the Japanese kept their distance from the Germans, who they were allied with, when it came to the question of Jews. Next. So the war is over by by July, August of 1945. About 11,000 refugees are on welfare, very, very poor. There's a bombing in the ghetto on July 17, 45 by the United States Air Force. Right next to where the ghetto was a Japanese military facility. So they killed 31 refugees, 250 were wounded. And the Japanese lost control by the end of August, and the designated area is opened in September. Okay, so the war is over. Everyone has survived. Manny Siegel, who was Laura's assistant, a man assisting a woman, was released or he escaped from a Japanese prison camp. He comes back to Shanghai. Now, one thing you have to understand, a lot of people think almost everyone left. Why did they leave? Well, there's a civil war between the nationalists and the communists. But what you have to understand, it was the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, America's ally, that wanted the Jews out. The most important thing to them was to end extraterritoriality. That's what all these foreign governments had for their nationals. So as far as the Chinese were concerned, if there are Germans in the city, we don't care if they're Jewish or if they're Christian or if they're Nazis, whatever, we want them out. We want everyone out. And they wanted to be independent. They wanted to be free of foreign domination. They wanted all foreigners to leave. So basically what happened was the UN stepped in. The refugees got a lot of aid from the United States Army, which occupied the city, along with the Nationalist Army. 1,500 Jewish refugees went to work for the US Army. But the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration spent tens of millions of dollars on these Jewish refugees to keep them alive. But basically, they paid for people to be repatriated to Germany and Austria. A couple thousand went back. Others went to the United States, Australia, and then Palestine, Israel. The most popular place, most people wanted to go to the United States, but there was a problem of the old American quotas. One of the amazing things, you had a lot of German Jews where someone in the family had been born in Poland. They couldn't get into the United States because of the quota. Because you had all these refugees in Europe that wanted to come in under the Polish quota. You could only let in 2,000 people a year. So they'd have to sit for years in Shanghai waiting to get a visa to the United States. It was very, very difficult. Okay, so that's more or less the story. I think we're just about through. Next slide. So 18,000 refugees found a safe haven in Shanghai. What do we learn from this, or how do we explain it? The Japanese allowed it. Without a doubt, without the Japanese, they allowed it. They were in control. They were in charge. They let the Jews come in. The Chinese authorities fostered it as well. They had no problems with it, but they weren't major players. They weren't major actors. Now, one thing, I'm on the board of this. It's a fantastic museum. One of you mentioned before that you had visited the museum, and you see on the museum, there's a museum in this synagogue that I visited. It's no longer a synagogue. The Chinese government has put millions of dollars into it. And they tried to show, this is the solidarity between the Chinese people and the Jewish people, which is true. But the fact is that Chinese had little to do with what took place, because they were being persecuted by the Japanese. But the image that the Chinese present, and they want to present, is, we save these people. there's some truth to that, but it's complex. The local Jewish community assisted, first the Sfaradim, the Iraqis, and later on the Russian community. But JDC is really the organization that provides the crucial support. Without JDC, many people would not have made it. And my final point, which I just go back to something I said before, it's sort of an irony, is that in 1939, but one has to be fair, no one really knew what was coming. But in 1939, when Jews could still get out and they could still come to Shanghai, everyone was pressuring the Germans. Jewish organizations in Shanghai, in New York, in London, they were all pressuring the German Jews and German government, don't let them come. It's sort of ironic. And the Germans wanted them out. Okay, I think we'll end there and we'll open it up to questions or comments.
All right, so feel free to type questions in the chat. Let me take a look and see if we have any here. Okay, actually, I'll start with these, and then if you want to keep adding questions, or if you want to just unmute and call them out when I'm done, that's fine as well. So the first question is from Stephen Brandina. Did you discuss the Gestapo plans recommended to the Japanese to put all of the Jews? Yes, I'm sorry, we already got to that about putting the Jews on a ship to sink it. And then I'm not sure who this is, owner. Do you know anything about the Jews that went to Haiti in the 1930s? Did they perhaps come from Shanghai?
Okay, wait a minute. These I can read, or you're asking the question?
I'm asking you the questions. Yeah. So
do a question one at a time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. The first one you'd already touched on, so I didn't repeat it. The second question was, do you know anything about the Jews that went to Haiti in the 1930s? Did they perhaps come from Shanghai?
There was I'm trying to remember the name of the. Not in Haiti. Very few went to Haiti, but there was from the Evian Conference.
The Dominican Republic.
Yeah, Dominican Republic. Yeah, not Haiti. In the Dominican Republic, Trujillo set up. The name escapes me of the settlement. It really doesn't matter. But there was an agricultural. He said something about, "I'll take in 10,000 Jews." So they had this area. He bought a farm, or he bought land, or he had land, and he wanted to develop. So they're going to set up Jewish farmers. So a couple of hundred families ended up going to the Dominican Republic, the JDC was very much involved with it. Some of the JDC people that had worked in the Soviet Union and the Crimea under the communist authorities, when they had Jews going back to work the soil, and they set up Jewish kolchozim, these kolchozim, collective settlements in the Crimea, which the Germans then killed. That was all part of a JDC project. The same people that set that up went to the Dominican Republic. But it was a couple hundred families, and in the end, it wasn't thousands or tens of thousands that made it to the Dominican Republic. And one of the problems you had was many of the people that were refugees that wanted to come really weren't farmers. And he wanted this, it was supposed to be a farming community, although other people worked in the city, etc.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? You can raise your hand, or you can just call out, unmute and call out.
Okay.
We have a.
Let me just read one of the questions. Someone asked, my grandmother's sister was Victor's, mother. Oh, I was born in Shanghai. Oh, wow. And interned with my parents, an uncle in a Japanese camp, Weishin in the north. Oh, wow. So there's someone there that was born in Shanghai, in your community. Ellen Chaim Krakow, yeah.
Hi, Ellen. Ellen says, thank you, Fred. This is all very familiar to me. I can share some of the same stories. My family fled Nazi Germany in 1939 to Shanghai. I was born there in 1947, and in 1949, with the help of the JDC, went to Israel. We lived in Renana for 3 years, finally getting the proper paperwork. My father was one of those under Polish quotas to immigrate to the US, Washington Heights. Wow. Ellen, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I can tell a lot of stories.
Wow, fascinating.
In fact, if I may say, I also go around speaking about my family's journey from Berlin to Shanghai to Israel to the United States. I share all of that information with everybody, and I have tons of stuff here still from my family. They saved everything, document every piece of paper. Thank you very much. This was very interesting.
Okay, I wanted to, I think one of the things that's interesting to me as someone that does research on the subject is the whole question about when you deal with Laura. She was a woman. She was quite an important person that enabled a lot of people to survive during the war. But the other thing that made an impression on me, I spent a month or two in the Shanghai Municipal Archives. And I read through various documents from the Shanghai Municipal Council, because everything until 41, everything was in English. But they had one folder there of all these sad cases of various families that were writing letters to the Shanghai Municipal Council. Can you let my wife in? Or can you let my children and their mother come to the country? Because they more or less had closed everything down in 39 and 40. So there was a family named Kirsch, a man named Eric Kirsch, and he had showed up and made it. He made it out of a concentration camp, and he was stuck in Shanghai, and his wife and son were left behind in Germany. And he was pleading with the municipal council to let them come. And that was it. I read the story, and it didn't look as though the council was willing to cooperate, etc. So when I came back to the States, I Googled the name of the son, and it turned out the son was living in Cincinnati. He evidently survived, and he made it. But the point that I wanted to make here was...
I'm on Google, I'm on Zoom.
Yeah.
But sorry.
The point was, the wife, who was left alone in Germany, managed to do everything. You know, one shouldn't be surprised that a woman can do it too, but she had to go and get tickets, and she had to go to the Gestapo, and she had to get all these documents so that they would let her leave Germany, and then travel all this way alone, etc. And she made it to Shanghai. She brought her son, and the family was reunited. So women played a very, very important role in terms of survival.
We have another question that just came in, actually two others. One from Marcy. Is there still a Shanghai Jewish community? And also, are there Jewish communities in other parts of China that began with World War II?
Oh, okay. First of all, we'll separate out the questions. When I was in Shanghai doing this research in the archives, one weekend I was stuck in Shanghai. I couldn't get out. I wanted to go to another city where they have a program in Jewish studies, but I couldn't go. So it turned out it was Hanukkah. And what do you do in Hanukkah? You go to Chabad. So there are at least, I don't want to exaggerate, there are at least 2, if not 4, Chabad outposts in Shanghai in different neighborhoods. There were a couple, up until very recently, there were a couple of thousand, maybe 2,000, 3,000 Jewish people working in Shanghai. Many of them Israelis, Americans, Europeans, working in high tech, in medicine, research, businesses, all these different types of things. It's like an international community. And there are a couple of small synagogues. And what the Chinese government does, it opens up Ohel Rachel, Rachel's Tent Synagogue, built by one of these, built by Hadun. I'm pretty sure it was Hadun. I might be mixed up with it. There were 2 synagogues. but he built this gigantic synagogue, which in 1949, the Chinese government seized since there were all the Jews were leaving or had left. But they turned it over, they opened it up every time there's a major Jewish holiday. And so they had like 300 or 400 people came to a Hanukkah party. There were other cities. There's Harbin, which is like in Manchuria in the north. I can't pronounce it, Tsie-Tsin. There were a couple of hundred. In the 30s, there were hundreds of people, hundreds of Jews living in 3 or 4 different cities all over China. Now, Harbin used to be, in the 1920s, Harbin was the largest Jewish community in the Far East. But in 31, after the Japanese came, there was a lot of anti-Semitism with the White Russians, which was a large local migrant refugee or community. So a lot of Jews started migrating, the Russians, from Harbin down into Shanghai. Now, there's also the ancient Jewish community of Kaifeng. I pronounce something like K-E-Y-F-A-N-G or F-I-N-G. It's in Henan province. Jews came there at around the 10th or 11th century. Traders, like Marco Polo, that route. Jews came and they had a synagogue and they had study houses, a couple of hundred people, and that they left. They have in the local museum, there are stones, that there are carvings on the stones, like writing on the stone, all about the Jewish community. They left these 3 or 4 that they still have. Now, believe it or not, there were descendants from these Kaifeng Jews. And there was an attempt made by the Iraqi Jews in the 20s and 30s to bring them back to Judaism. They were willing to fund the studying of Hebrew and sending a rabbi up there and things like that. So there's still a couple of people that claim they're descendants of the Kaifeng Jewish community. The local government is very sensitive about it because a Christian group, one of the reasons why I didn't go to away for Hanukkah time, the last time I was in China, was I was invited to Henan University to lecture, and they canceled my lecture. Why did they cancel my lecture? Because I'm from Ben Gurion University, and the local government and the regional government of Henan was very upset that a group of Christian missionaries had come into town and financed descendants of the Jewish community to move to Israel. That'll bring the Messiah. To move to Israel, and they were enraged that a Chinese family would leave China to go to another country. So because of that, they canceled my invitation. So there's still that Kaifeng community. There are a lot of people that have written about Kaifeng. It's a fascinating story. And there's also a Jewish community. There always has been in Hong Kong. The Kadoris, when they left after the war, they went to Hong Kong and they moved their businesses to Hong Kong, etc. But even before, under the British, the Kadoris were very successful in Hong Kong. They owned all the power, they owned the ferry, they owned a lot of different things.
Yes, Iris, I see your hand is raised.
So I was there just before the Olympics in Beijing. I was in Shanghai, and I had a tour of the Jewish section. First, we went to the hotel, Sassoon's Hotel, and then we went to the Jewish section where the homes are still there, the row houses on one side, and on the other side, the tenement for the people that came later, and the Jews that came later. And the guide told us that they were planning to raise the entire area, but I understand that they never did that it still stands. I'm not sure, I'm asking you that. And secondly, the guide was the head of a program to restore the cemetery there, the Jewish cemetery. And he went around the country collecting headstones that were used in the fields of farms, that kind of thing. He would go and he would cart them back to a warehouse in Shanghai, and he was hoping that someday he would be able to put them back in the cemetery. So I'm asking if you know anything about that.
Okay, well, I know the guy, I forget his name, but when you mentioned
His
the
name
video,
is-
he collects
His name is
these
Devere
tombstones.
Bargal.
Yeah.
Devere Bargal,
Yeah, okay.
that's his name.
But he collects the tombstones and all of that. Now, for a while in the early 50s, I haven't looked at all the files. JDC was sending over money to preserve it, to take care of some of the synagogues. There were a couple of Jewish cemeteries. So I gather that a lot of with all the building and everything else that takes place, I'm not trying to justify anything. A lot of the cemeteries were destroyed, and the stones, people might have just taken the stones and used them for other things as well. So I don't know what, I gather he wanted to set up, my sense was that he was going to set up a museum or something with the various headstones that he had. Now, one of the things that's sad about Shanghai, but I guess it depends what your values are. And I've seen it, I've been going there now for a little over 20 years. It's day and night in terms of all these old neighborhoods with these row houses and all that, one after the other. It's not just where the Jews live in this particular Hamkou area. They're all being knocked down. And they're putting up all these high rises and everything else. I mean, it's like if you look at New York City or any place, I don't know what Florida, I don't know what happens in Florida in major cities, but it's sad to see the transition to this modern society with shopping centers. I mean, Shanghai has hundreds of malls. I mean, it's hard to picture, but it's a city of, I don't know, over 20 million and hundreds of malls. So everything is being torn down. But some of the Jewish area will probably, a small part of it will probably be preserved. That's my sense. Because it's in their interest. They want it preserved. It's a big tourist attraction.
Thank you.
All right, well, in the interest of time, we're going to conclude. We did record this session. We'll upload it to our YouTube page. So for those of you who have friends who missed tonight, please let them know that the session will be uploaded and they'll have an opportunity to view it. Thank you again to everybody who came. Big thank you to Professor Lazen. This was fascinating. I learned a lot. And I hope I see lots of silent claps coming around. Thank you, everybody. This was
Thank
fabulous.
you very much, too. I enjoyed, and I'm happy we had an opportunity.
Wonderful. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi Boxman.
Thank you.